Hello, guys and gals, and this is part 4 of our reading of Neptune 1 is Missing. It is a novel by Hugh Walters, and we're going to go over the copyright information, which is right here. It is copyright 1969 by Hugh Walters, and it says here, all rights reserved, including the right to reproduce this book or portions thereof in any form. So, anyways, let me go back to the picture here. Okay. Anyways, in the last episode, the astronauts entered hypersleep, but there was a problem. There was a short or a loose wire in the hypothermia machine, and so now the ship is on fire. So we're gonna find out what's gonna happen. It doesn't look good though. So, anyways, that is basically the gist of what's happened so far. As, choking, he struggled up from his couch, the answer struck Chris in a blinding flash. The smoke had seemed to appear suddenly because they had just awakened from hypothermia. The ship was on fire, and the smoke had come from that. Never in all their long experiences had they met such a situation. Not only had the fire broken out during their not once had fire broken out during their many voyages. Though they had known it was possible, every precaution is taken in building spaceships, but the unexpected can still happen. Their training had anticipated the possibility. Though they had sometimes thought that they had sometimes thought that the fire drill was a waste of time. Tony particularly had always grumbled at what he regarded as a useless part of their routine. He'd never complain again. Though he knew that an electric light must be burning, Chris found it difficult to see. The smoke was so thick. Trying to hold his breath, he raised himself up. To his amazement, he floated away from his couch fastening. He should have been held down by the gentle deceleration. What had happened to the atomic motor? Had it been destroyed or damaged by the fire, or had it been the cause of the fire? These and thousands of other questions thrust themselves into his mind as he fought to control his choking. Then, though his senses were beginning to reel, the rigid discipline and training took over. Chris forced himself to think calmly. He couldn't afford to lose control of his mental processes again. Oxygen. He must get oxygen. The fire had already removed much of the life-giving gas from the cabin's atmosphere. He and his companions would quickly suffocate in the blinding smoke unless he could get to their space helmets. As he thought of the solution, Chris shivered at the prospect. Their spacesuits were stored not in the fridge, but in the main cabin below, where conditions were like... what conditions were like there, he didn't know. The cabin could well be a mass of flame, and it might be impossible to reach the suits. If this was so, they were indeed doomed. But whatever the circumstances, he must make an attempt to reach the only pieces of equipment that could save their lives. Better to die in the almost hopeless task than to perish in miserable inactivity. With the rasping coughs of his companions grating upon his ears, Chris fumbled for the hatch into the cabin below. There was still a confusion of unanswered questions in his mind, but those could wait. He must concentrate on getting at those suits. Oh! That was the hatch. His finger encountered the familiar fastening which he twisted. A gust of heat, like something almost solid, came from the main cabin as he swung the hatch open. It was impossible to go any further. No, it mustn't be impossible. Even if he was scorched to a cinder, he must plunge into the searing heat and smoke. No flames were visible, just heat and smoke. His chest feeling as if it were ready to burst, Chris tried to concentrate on his task. First, he must try to judge the position of the locker holding the suits. There was no margin for error. Already he could feel that it would not be long before his senses left him. He wouldn't have time to fumble about seeking the locker. Arms held out before him, Chris launched himself into the blackness. Pray God he was floating in the right direction. Though each of the astronauts had to be as familiar with the cabin as with his own face, under these conditions, even to remember direction was difficult. His hand struck something solid, the cabin wall. With a silent prayer of thanks, Chris knew it was the locker. He wrenched at the door. It didn't move. In a moment of near panic, Chris again twisted the catch, but he'd done this already. No, it was the heat causing the door to expand. That was the cause of the trouble. Exerting every ounce of his ebbing strength, he tugged again at the locker door, and it flew open. It was just then that he had the first momentary burst of unconsciousness. As he recovered, he had to fight back panic. Was he going to fail with the suits in his grasp? His fingers felt the shape of a helmet, and he tore it from its mooring. It didn't matter whose it was. If he was to be of any help to the others, he must get it on instantly so that the life-giving oxygen could flow. Though it was a bad fit, whether because he wasn't wearing a spacesuit or because it wasn't his own, he didn't know. At least it would keep the acrid smoke from his eyes and lungs. With swiftly moving fingers, Chris connected up one of the small emergency cylinders, and within seconds he was drawing deep, delightful breaths of pure oxygen. There was no time to lose, not even time to make his own helmet more secure. He must get back into the fridge with the other 3 helmets and oxygen cylinders if his friends were to survive. With strength returning all the time and the burning pain in his chest decreasing every second, Chris managed to gather up the 3 helmets, which he held by the oxygen pipe like 3 vast onions. Onions. Under the other arm, he held the weightless cylinders of oxygen. With a push, he sprung in what he had hoped was the right direction, but instead of reaching the hatch into the fridge, he collided with a solid wall. The temperature in the cabin was becoming unbearable. Light clothing worn for hypothermia was no protection from the heat of the fire. If the crew were to survive at all and try to deal with the combustion, it would be essential for them to wear their protective spacesuits. However, the first essential, Chris kept telling himself, was to find the hatch and deliver the helmets. With both his hands full, he found the utmost difficulty in maneuvering himself along the cabin wall. He would push off with his foot only to find that he was floating across to the other side of the cabin. There he would have to twist around and push off again. It was only after seven such transits that he found his objective. With a great feeling of relief, Chris felt the rim of the hatch and pushed his burden through. Thanks to the oxygen and helmet, his eyes were smarting much less. As he pulled himself through into the fridge, he found he could just see the glimmer of the electric bulb through the thick smoke. This helped him to judge the direction of the couches, and he groped his way towards them. The first one he encountered was empty. Whether it was his own or belonged to one of his companions, he couldn't tell. Anxious, he stretched across the next. In this one, someone was still strapped. As he ran his fingers lightly over the recumbent form, he found the chest heaving in its last desperate struggle. Though because of the helmet Chris couldn't hear, he could imagine the awful choking gasps that would be punctuating the losing struggle for life. He grabbed one of the helmets that he'd left floating near him As he raised the head of his friend on the couch, he could tell it was Maury. With difficulty, he slipped the helmet on and made it as secure as he could. Then he had to find one of the oxygen cylinders, which should be floating close at hand. There was one. Chris quickly attached it to Maury's helmet and hoped for the best. He couldn't waste time to see if the American regained consciousness. With some difficulty, Chris located the second helmet and cylinder. These he fitted to the next unconscious form, who he could tell was Tony. His heart sank as he completed his task, for he had been unable to detect any struggle to breathe, as he had in the stronger Maury. Without losing a second, Chris fumbled about for the third cylinder and mask, and he fretted at the few moments it took him to find them. Surge was quickly attended to, and for the first time, Chris could relax for a few seconds. He knew that he'd done all that he could for his three friends. If he had been in time, they would revive. If not, they would die. He felt the perspiration running down his face from a combination of heat and his exertions and his anxiety for his crew. The smoke was getting thicker again, but he managed to fumble his way to the couches for a moment. He felt thankful that none of his friends had managed to free themselves from the contour couch. His task would have been much harder if the three bodies had been floating about somewhere in the smoke-filled cabin. He'd been the only one who managed to unstrap himself when the smoke first started to choke them. The movement that he saw as he approached Maury's couch was a most welcome sight. This one, at least, would be reviving now that oxygen was blowing into his lungs. But what about Tony and Serge? With growing anxiety, Chris felt his way to the mechanic's couch. His fingers could find no sign of respiration, so Chris began artificial respiration with gentle rhythmic pressure. He squeezed and then released Tony's chest. Under zero gravity, it was the only method he could apply. The kiss of life was ruled out by their helmets. Chris had been pumping away at Tony for 5 minutes without any response when something bumped into him. Dimly, through the smoke, he could see a helmeted figure. It must be Maury, he thought with relief. At least one of his crew had been saved. For a moment, Maury was making gestures by pointing at his helmet. For a moment, Chris couldn't tell what he meant. Helmet radio. It came to him suddenly that he'd forgotten to switch it on. He did so at once, and immediately Maury's voice came gasping through. "What happened? Where's the fire? Have we arrived?" he panted. "Don't know anything," Chris called back briefly. "Can you find out if Serge is all right?" The figure of Maury disappeared into the whirling smoke, and moments later he reported that the Russian seemed to be recovering. "Come and work on Tony," Chris ordered Maury. "I'm going down below to see if I can find the fire." You'll never do it, Chris," Maury protested as he floated into view of Tony's couch. "I can feel the heat in here." "I'll bring back a suit first," Chris promised. "If I can get into the heat." "I'll bring back a suit first," Chris promised. "If I can get into one, the heat shouldn't worry me." "Good luck," Maury called as he took over the resuscitation of Tony. "Keep the radio on and sing out if I can help." "I'll manage," Chris said firmly. "You keep working on Tony. Let me know how Serge goes on." So saying, he propelled himself toward the hatch. Even before he passed through it, he could see his light clothing beginning to turn brown in the heat. Then he plunged into the cabin below. Chapter 6. Chris could have shrieked with pain as he touched the door of the storage locker. He felt as if lumps of his flesh had been left on the handle. It was Maury's voice on the helmet radio, anxiously inquiring if he was all right, that steadied Chris enough for him to gasp out that he was. More by feel than by sight, he collected a spacesuit and pushed off towards the hatch. He must have fainted from the pain of his of his scorched flesh. For the next thing he knew was that Maury was peering through his visor with obvious concern. "Thank God you've come around," Maury said fervently. When you didn't when you didn't answer my call, I was coming after you. I could see by the way you were floating through the hatch that you were unconscious. How are you feeling now?" "Well enough," Chris lied. "What about the others?" "Tony is still out, but Serge is all right. As a matter of fact, it was his suit you brought out, so he put it on and gone to collect the other three. He he should have stayed here. That was my job." Chris winced. "And how do you think you could have worn his suit?" asked Maury. That silenced the leader, for the Russian suit was smaller than Chris's. It would have been impossible for anyone but Serge to wear it safely. "Do not worry, I'm all right," the voice of Serge sounded in their helmets. "The suit is protecting me against the heat, but I cannot find the suit locker. I cannot see anything at all." Chris was half inclined to ask Serge if he could see where the fire was, but he decided not to distract his companion from the task at hand. Once they were all suited up, it would be time to deal with the fire. "I think he's responding." This time it was Maury's voice that Chris heard. Sure enough, when he went to peer over the recumbent figure that was receiving Maury's attention, he could see below his visor a slight fluttering in Tony's eyelids. Chris felt a great flood of relief. Soon he would be able to attend to other pressing problems. Meanwhile, the temperature was still rising. "Found it," Serge reported triumphantly. "Stand by to catch a suit." Chris propelled himself to the hatch, and a few seconds later, a grotesque, shapeless thing came floating through. "I have it," he called out to Serge below. "Can you cope?" The Russian answered him confidently that he could. So Chris tried to identify the suit that was floating so conveniently at hand. It was his own, but before he could start putting it on, he must receive the other two from Serge. In a very short time, this was accomplished, and Serge came floating up through the hatch. "I'll see to Tony if you will help yourselves," Serge said. So while he struggled to suit up the now semi-conscious mechanic, Chris and Maury helped each other to put on their protective clothing. Chris was in great pain from his burnt hand, and putting on the glove was real agony. Still, there wasn't time to get any first aid. Unless they could control the fire speedily, first aid would be pointless. "What happened?" Tony's voice came suddenly. "Lie still, old chap. We've a bit of a fire aboard," Chris called back. "Stay on your couch till you're feeling stronger." "No, that's an order," he went on as Tony began to declare that he was quite fit. One after another, Chris, Serge, and Maury entered the main cabin, through which they were through though which although they were now protected from the smoke and heat, it was impossible to see anything, and all their investigations must be by touch. They split up and began feeling everything with which they had come into contact. It was now, of course, that their gloves were a hindrance, for because they protected them from heat, they also prevented the astronauts from telling whether anything was hot. "This cable's gone," Maury called out suddenly. "In fact, it's still smoldering." "Where are you?" Chris asked. "At number 2 control panel," Maury's voice answered. "Whew, this is a mess." It was at that moment that Chris himself discovered evidence of further damage. He'd come in contact with the hypothermia apparatus. The formerly smooth casing was distorted and split, and a wire was glowing redly in the opening. "The AHA's gone," he reported to his friends. "Maybe it's defrosted us earlier than programmed." "That's better than not doing it at all," Tony's voice declared. "I wonder," Chris thought. A tug on his arm attracted his attention, and he found himself floating after Serge. The Russian was signaling to him not to use the radio. Mystified, Chris acknowledged the request and followed his companion. Serge was had now located a powerful torch, and its beams penetrated about 2 feet of the penetrated about 2 feet of the gloom. Chris could see that he was being led to a part of the cabin away from Maury. Following the light of the torch as best he could, he saw that Surge had indicated a spot where an oxygen supply pipe came through the floor from the storage tanks in the huge compartment below. Chris maneuvered himself until he saw the pipe closely in the circle of light from the torch. At first, he didn't know what he was looking for. Then he saw it. There was a faint split in the pipe, caused no doubt by the heat in the cabin. From the way the smoke had been pushed away from the crack, Chris saw that oxygen was escaping, and the significance of them struck him. The significance of this struck him at once. While they had been frozen, the oxygen content of the atmosphere in the cabin and the fridge had been reduced. Because of this, the fire had been slow to spread and would have smoldered itself out but for the crack. Now fresh oxygen was flowing into the cabin, and it wouldn't be long before there was enough for the smoldering cables to ignite. If that happened, it would almost certain that fire would penetrate into the fuel tanks. Chris shuddered as he pictured the consequences. He could understand why Surge hadn't wanted him to use the radio. Tony would be listening. This was a job for the mechanic, and Tony would have insisted on leaving his couch, although he hadn't fully recovered. Yet Chris could see the terrible danger they were in, and he knew that neither he nor the others had Tony's skill. Reluctantly, he decided he had to call for Tony's help. "How are you feeling, Tony?" he asked as calmly as he could. "Much better now," Tony's voice replied. "Have you found the fire? The smoke's getting thicker." "Yes, we found it," Chris called back. "Some wiring is gone." "Are you fit enough to do a small job?" "Of course," Tony answered indignantly. What do you think I am on this trip? A passenger? Well, take it easy. There's a cracked oxygen pipe. Can you patch it?" "I'm on my way, but I wish we could get rid of this smoke," Tony replied. "Yes, of course," thought Chris. "We're all wearing our spacesuits. I could open the airlock and let the smoke be sucked out. It would also reduce the risk of fire," he told the others what he meant to do and asked them to stand by. With the help of Surge's torch, Chris found his way to the airlock. Now he must use extreme care. Normally the air in the cabin would be pumped out, both to conserve oxygen and to reduce the pressure difference with the vacuum outside. It wasn't possible to do that now. There was no time, and from the state of the wiring, Chris doubted whether the pump would work. He must open the airlock only slightly, otherwise he would be shot out into space, and he hadn't a pressure gun with him. First, Chris opened the inner door in the cabin hall, and then, at his request, Maury and Surge almost closed it behind him. He must now open the outer door, and this was the most dangerous part of the job. Maury and Surge were ready. They had wedged something in the inner door to keep it open a couple of inches. Slowly, Chris unscrewed the fastening. If he unloosened it too much, the door would fly wide outward and would allow it. And he would follow it, rather. He must stop just before the last turn of the screw. This would allow the air and smoke to be sucked out into the void without actually opening the door. As carefully as a burglar trying to unlock a safe, Chris turned the screw. He could see the smoke-laden air being drawn to the crack around the edge of the door. Another fraction of a turn, and the smoke increased its rush to the void. This was as much as he dared open the door until the pressure inside had fallen. When it had dropped much further, he could fling the door open so that the last vestiges of the polluted atmosphere would escape. Inside the main cabin, Surge was straining to watch the pressure gauge. Because of the dense smoke, his visor was almost touching the glass of the dial before he could see the falling needle at all clearly. 58, 580, he reported to Chris. Tony had now managed to join his friends, and Maury was showing him the damaged wiring. He whistled his whistle of dismay came clearly over all their radios. Pretty bad, they heard him mutter. Until the atmosphere was a little clearer, Tony would be unable to discover the full extent of the damage, but even the limited examination he'd made revealed a serious state of affairs. He made his way over to the storage cupboard where some of the tools and spares were kept. 470, Surge's voice called out. It was now getting easier to see, but the better visibility brought no comfort to Tony. Great blocks of wiring had fused, and blackened cables indicated the seriousness of the situation. To Tony, it seemed less than an hour since he'd left the cabin to enter the fridge. When all had been well, this damage must have been building up over a long period. So how long have we been asleep? 3:20, Surge called. There was still too much air inside the ship for Chris to open the door. He waited patiently as the smoke flowed past him. At about 200, he'd risk it. How was Tony getting on? As he waited for the pressure to fall, Chris allowed himself to start thinking about their position. Was it hopeless? The ship was badly damaged, and they were millions of miles from Earth. That their flight program had been seriously interrupted. Chris had no doubt they were too far from Earth to expect any help. Could they patch up Neptune 1 sufficiently for it to get them home? 200. With a quick jerk, Chris gave the handle a last twist, and the door flew outwards. Fortunately, he'd braced himself against a rush of air. Even so, he felt the pressure against his body as the ship's atmosphere was drawn out. In a few moments, it was over. The pressure had dropped to zero, and inside the cabin was a cold, clear vacuum. Chris peered out of the hatch and begin his turn to rejoin the crew. It was immensely black, with a vast array of stars everywhere. One seemed much brighter than the rest, the sun. Would they ever bask beneath its warming rays again? We are going to have to stop that here. We have been reading from Neptune 1 is Missing. It is a book by Hugh Walters. If you like this content, then make sure you like and subscribe and ring the bell so you know when I upload. Also, if you want to support me in any way, or if you want to join the Discord server, all that information will be in the description below. As always, thanks for watching, everyone, and have a great day.